All right. Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Yeah. Welcome. Welcome to the 2024-2025 Cybersecurity Seminar Series. I'm Dr. Stan. You're going to get to see me if you're going to come back to any of these seminar series, which is cool. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Scott Shackelford from IU. Scott is a distinguished professor at the IU School of Business, the Kelley School of Business. He has lots of titles. I'm going to let him introduce his titles to you. He has some interesting past, right? He's worked at NASA. You have no background in computer science. Or
Zero.
Stuff like that, right? Yeah. You won't know it from talking to him. And he's written a children's book, which is pretty cool. So join me in welcoming Scott.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a dark and stormy afternoon to learn about cybersecurity, right? You guys, I know a lot of you have taken various types of cybersecurity before, forensics and otherwise, so some of this, I think they're going to be familiar terms, familiar concepts, right? But for a lot of you guys, this might be some new stuff. I'm going to be talking about it from a very global, high-level snapshot, right? Where are we at? Where are we going? Where are those trend lines converging? Where are they diverging around the world, right? With regards to cybersecurity, like you see up there, and AI. Love to have this be interactive, useful for you guys, first and foremost. So we'll keep 10 minutes at the end for questions, but interrupt as we go, okay? Like, what? Well, this is totally for your benefit, and it's a pleasure to be here. So thanks to Brian, thanks to Sid, and everybody for this great opportunity. So, as was mentioned, I do a few different things at IU. I wanted to flag just two of them in case they're of interest to you guys, okay? Because everything we do, of course, public university, it's all freely accessible. You guys can join as you would like. One is, like here, we have a cybersecurity speaker series as well at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, which I direct. Been around for more than 20 years. It was IU's first attempt to kind of bridge the divide between the operational and academic sides of the house. Right? So we have a lot of different folks coming through. We just had economists from MIT last week talking about cyber risk modeling, catastrophic coverage in the insurance context, how you model that type of behavior. All the talks we've done are all archived on the site, but once a month, again, there's going to be live ones. The next one is next Thursday. It's all about healthcare privacy and security. And then we have Josephine Wolf from Tufts coming in November to talk about Internet of Things security and some more around insurance. So check it out, cacr.iu. You're welcome to join the listservs. Let me know after we're done if you have questions or would like to get involved. There's a lot of different projects we always have going on, including right now 400 cybersecurity assessments we're doing with Purdue, looking at local governments all around the state, right? Warts and all. So questions around ransomware. A lot of interesting research findings that are coming out. One, I'll just kind of tease, is called the Transformative 12. So the team at CACR were able to identify the 12 most impactful security controls for local governments, right? And we're starting to assess each of these out of that 400 and then informing policymakers to figure out, well, do we need more carrots or sticks, right, to incentivize that type of uptake? So talk more about that during Q&A or otherwise if you guys are interested. The other research center that I had the privilege of directing, this was the children's book, okay, is named for Lynn Ostrom. And my guess is nobody's heard of Lynn Ostrom before. Has anybody heard of her? Now you have, which is great. She should be more famous in Indiana, right? She is the first woman ever to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And she's a Hoosier, damn it. So that's just pretty cool. So she and her husband Vincent were refugees from mainstream political science back in the 70s because they had this crazy idea that they wanted data to back up their research, right? So they went out, they did field work. They were looking at, municipal governance, and they were actually doing ride-alongs in cop cars. They were seeing how many potholes there were in cities, right? There were actual monitors they were using to gauge these things. And because of that empirical approach, they built this whole field of study, which eventually they applied toward this idea of the commons. Have you guys heard the tragedy of the commons, this idea before? So is this, tragedy a little bit. What is the tragedy of the commons, if you had to encapsulate it? What comes to mind, at least, like an illustration or something?
It's essentially that if there's like a finite amount of resources that are freely available, then they'll eventually sort of run out because they're constantly being used.
Perfect. That was kind of Garrett Hardin's traditional approach, right? And the only way out of this overexploitation nightmare is either Big Brother has to step in, right? So you have to nationalize that, picture a pasture or a forest or a fishery or whatever it is, or you have to privatize it, right? Lynn and her collaborators won the Nobel Prize in part because they found a third way, right? They found the ways in which communities can self-organize to sustainably manage those common pool resources, right? So fisheries, forests, all that, but also knowledge commons, right? So we're applying some of those same insights that she was looking at toward the end of her career before she passed on climate change to now issues around, for example, space, even space cybersecurity. And I'll mention that while I'm mentioning it now. There's a space cybersecurity badge program that we're just launching, pun intended, next week. So if any of you guys are interested, let me know. We have scholarships available for it. So if you looked at the Kelley site and looked at Space Cyber, there's going to be a big price tag. Don't let that sway you. Let me know if you're interested, and I can get you in touch, and I'm sure we can get scholarship funding for it. But it's pretty cool. You're going to learn from lots of industry folks, a lot of Space Force people, all about the different hot topics in space cyber. But that's just one of those areas that we look at the workshop. And just like CACR, every Monday and Wednesday, there's a research series. We have working groups that run the gambit, AI governance, blockchain governance, you name it. So you can check out oceanworkshop.indiana. If you want a copy of that children's book, let me know, all right? And I can get one of those for you too. It's a little longer than it should be. I tried, right? I have 3 girls. I have a target audience, but still, it's too dense. We did our best though. Okay, so now that that's a little bit out of the way, guys, what I'm going to try to do now is talk a little bit about current state of play, basically the bad news, all right? Then the good news, what are we doing about these different issues? We'll focus on cyber first, we'll do some AI, like I said, interrupt as we go, all right? We'll see how much we get through. This is a bit of a choose your own adventure toward the end. All right. Cyber attacks have been around for a while now, even though we're constantly being screamed at them in the headlines today. Okay, any guesses, guys? What decade would you say cyber attacks really started in earnest? You think before a lot of you were born? It's fair enough. All right. You think 2000s, 90s, 80s? I hear 70s. Are you thinking of one in particular? Whoever said that? Or? Oh yeah, Okay, I've recently nerded out more about this because I just finished our first history book. It's called Forks in the Digital Road, and it was looking back at some of these key decision points in the history of the internet. I did it with the CISO from Harvard. He just retired a couple years ago. So depending on how you define hack or cyber attack, you could go back a long ways, right? Even manipulating census information in Europe in World War II to avoid, the Holocaust, basically in France. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do this. What we think of as one of the more modern versions of cyber attacks really started November 2nd, 1988. Have you guys heard of the Morris worm before? Yeah, a couple, they definitely have, right? It should be more famous. So there was a guy, Roger Morris, a student not unlike yourselves, doing a research project, trying to figure out how much stuff was connected to the internet. Made a few mistakes, a few lines of code, things that kind of out of hand. What resulted was the first DDoS attack, basically, right? Whoops. Felt really bad about it. He sent a note of apology afterward. Unfortunately, though, we just had the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act get passed. And here's another fun fact. Does anybody know why the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act got passed? Or what? Do you even know what the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is? And that's okay if not. So this is the first ever, but the federal law that makes it a crime to hack, right? To access another network without authorization or exceeding access is the actual terminology. That's so broad. Law enforcement loves it. It's like getting Al Capone on tax evasion, right? You can use that for lots of different purposes, okay? So because of that, a lot of civil rights groups for a long time have tried to narrow the scope, right, of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, because there was, among other things, a really high-profile suicide because this person had downloaded a lot of academic articles and was going to be prosecuted by the CFAA from the Department of Justice and committed suicide because of the stress involved, right? But that's an aside. Unfortunately, what we've seen is the opposite, right? The criminal penalties for CFAA violations have been ratcheted up over time. They haven't been lessened, okay? The reason we have that, just really quick story, is the movie War Games. Who's seen the movie War Games? Yes! Yes! If you haven't seen it, you know what you're doing on a rainy weekend in Terre Haute, all right? Great movie, early 80s, Matthew Broderick. I don't want to spoil too much for you, but you know, he's a hacker, all right? Early hacker, hacks into NORAD. There's some great scenes, classic scenes. The only way to win is not to play. Come on, so good. I won't spoil it for you. Reagan, movie buff, sees the movie. If you're a movie buff and you see this, what do you do after you see that movie in the early 1980s? You pick up the phone and call. You would call, somebody in the government, NORAD, and you would say, well, this was a really entertaining movie. Could this actually happen? Could somebody hack into our, nuclear command and control infrastructure? And the short answer was, maybe. So among other things, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act gets passed. Back to our story, Roger gets prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Don't feel too sorry for him. He's a professor at MIT. He's a .com millionaire. Things did not work out too poorly for the world's first cyber attacker in a lot of ways, right? What's different now, guys, is how quickly these attacks are proliferating in numbers, sophistication, severity. As you know, the fact that they're targeting companies and countries alike, and that the attack surface just keeps getting bigger, right? You guys have studied the Internet of Things a little bit? You've heard the phrase at least a little bit, all right? Simple idea, right? The notion that more and more stuff is connected to the internet than ever before. We've long since passed the point at which there's more internet-connected stuff than there are people on the planet. And that's cool, opens up a lot of business opportunities for you guys to explore, but also, that's a really big attack surface to exploit, right? And that also means there's a huge amount of technical debt, because there's a lot of stuff out there that we bought because it's kind of cool when you walk into a room and the lights come on. We didn't think about, well, should you be able to change the password in that smart light bulb? Or download a security update, right? So there's a lot of technical debt that can be manipulated out there. And also, and we'll talk about this more toward the end, only a few jurisdictions are trying to get a handle on it to not keep contributing to the problem, right? So today in California, if you buy an internet-connected product, you have to be able to change the password and do software updates, right? But that's in California, that's not here in Indiana, okay? So again, big problem, continues to be a big problem. It's also applicable in space, by the way. There's a lot of old hardware up there too, right? One of the guys that's lecturing in our series, Greg Falco at Cornell, he just wrote a great paper about how you launch ransomware attacks on satellites, right? And it's easier than you would think. It's not a bonus point assignment, don't try it. But you can check out his paper if you're interested. And guys, needless to say, it's becoming more and more of an issue in critical infrastructure. You guys have heard of critical infrastructure, a little bit, critical. What are some examples of critical infrastructure sectors that come to mind? What's important, what's essential?
Financial services.
Financial services, first and foremost, at the top of that pyramid, Brian, absolutely. What else do we got?
Urban transportation.
Transportation, great.
Power grid.
Power grid, right? There's more than 3,200 power utilities in the US, right? Germany has 4 major power utilities, so that's a big number right there, right? What else? What are some other examples?
Healthcare.
Healthcare, I mean, that's about 20% of our GDP right there, right?
Water treatment.
Water's one of those areas too that has not been really focused on at the federal level in terms of security, right? There was an EPA rule that really did focus on the cybersecurity of water utilities, but there was a lawsuit about 6 months ago that challenged it, and it's all on hold, right? There's an injunction against it. So that's definitely a gap, and we've seen it exploited, right, around the country. How many critical infrastructure sectors do we have? These are adding up pretty quick.
16.
16! Gold star. 16, right? Absolutely. And when you start to add these up, as you guys just saw, that's the vast majority of our economy, right? So if everything's critical, in other words, you might just think, well, is anything critical at the end of the day, right? And at the federal level, we have sector-specific laws, right, around finance, the stuff we really care about, around healthcare, HIPAA, right? Around the grid, especially after the blackout in New York, 2003, we started to finally enforce, some of the laws that had been industry codes of conduct, basically. But it's pretty haphazard. What's been the big change? Do we have a point agency now for critical infrastructure security? You know there's an alphabet soup in cyber, right? So I'm sorry, but has anybody heard of CISA? Now you have. Now you have, so this is the cybersecurity, basically, agency within the Department of Homeland Security that's tasked with protecting critical infrastructure. And boy, are they hiring like mad, right? More than 1,000 people over the last year. So we need you. Yes, question, comment?
Is CISA related to the CISA cybersecurity exam?
Not really. Since this is pretty new, it's only been around since 2018. So this kind of predates it. I will say that they have been doing more to work with, for example, NIST and other standard-setting bodies to create different, resources, certifications, that kind of thing. But no, that's separate. So CISA, though, is a worthwhile organization to pay attention to. There's two folks here in Indiana that are kind of our regional liaisons. Shatrice Mosley, who used to be our state cybersecurity coordinator, and there's a guy named JD who does it for Illinois and Indiana as well. Different JD. That's worth paying attention to as well. So critical infrastructure security, very big topic for one agency to get a handle on. Think about just one that we haven't mentioned yet, elections, right? Voting machines. So since 2017, elections have also fallen into critical infrastructure protection, right? Does anybody know how voting machines here in Indiana get certified? Who does that? Ball State. There's the team at Ball State that works with the Indiana Secretary of State's office on certifying voting machines, right? So again, we don't have one national process there. There used to be a NIST standard for voting machines. It's long since lapsed, right? So we don't have one national election, right? We have more than 3,000 local elections that get aggregated. So we can talk more about election security if we have time, though. I'm happy to take those questions, too. Thinking about critical infrastructure, cyber attacks, guys, this is a very quick survey of the last, basically 14, 15 years now, so we don't have time to dwell. But maybe just one or two. Have you guys heard of Stuxnet? Yeah, a little bit more on Stuxnet, Operation Olympic Games, right? So there's a great book called Countdown to Zero Day by Kim Zetter that, if you're interested, goes into the history of Stuxnet in a lot of detail. I'd also recommend This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends by Nicole Perlroth. She's a reporter at the New York Times, but really good, accessible book, right? Rarely are cybersecurity books like fun, interesting reads, right? Let's face it, but this one definitely counts. But Stuxnet, right, this was that crossing the Rubicon moment. We actually had, allegedly, of course, Israel, the US, working together to create this package that infiltrated Siemens programmable logic controllers at the uranium enrichment facility in Natanz, causing real-world damage, in other words, right? By cyber means and avoiding the need for kinetic strikes, missiles. Buying time, the argument goes, for the Iran nuclear deal, right? When you use cyber weapons, you can also send the blueprint along if you know what you're doing, which means they can be reverse engineered. So we have son of Stuxnet, great-grandson of Stuxnet. But it was the start of a new era, right? And we have seen, for example, Iran learn with this relatively quickly. So Saudi Aramco was hit. More than 30,000 of their systems were bricked in a wiper worm. This was a while ago, so no worries if you don't remember it. This was great, right? We had a casino get breached because of a vulnerability in its smart aquarium in the lobby. Talk about Internet of Things security, right? So always be mindful, that's cool. Is it worth it? Is it worth it, right? And then, we had, this was interesting. So Sony, this is another fun fact. The first time we ever had a sitting US president attribute a cyber attack back to a foreign country was the Sony breach, right? What was it about Sony, this particular incident, that you think that this was the one, right? There were lots of cyber attacks before this. Does anybody remember what was going on with this one? Again, this was a while ago. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah.
The interview?
The interview!
Yeah.
You can add it to your weekend movie list if you haven't seen it, right? Not the best movie, but it didn't exactly portray the leader of North Korea in the most favorable light. He doesn't have much of a sense of humor, that guy. It's weird. So in this case, Guardians of Peace, with deep ties to the North Korean regime, of course. They go after Sony. They release a lot of Sony's IP, right, in the form of unreleased movies, and a lot of email chains that don't exactly portray their stars or producers in the most favorable light, right? Why did the Obama administration care about that? It's not even a US company, after all, right? What do you think? Partly there were some threats about, hey, if you show this movie, we're going to bomb the theater. This was during the holiday season. That's not awesome. That's not great. But it wasn't just that. This was basically First Amendment concerns. It was basically free speech. Why should we let some foreign despot tell Americans what movies we get to consume, right? Please, yeah.
This movie in particular was making fun of a foreign powers leader.
Yeah, for sure, exactly. And partly this was defending the right of companies to be able to do this, because again, we have these strong free speech concerns. So this just goes to show that each administration draws some of these lines in their own ways. And in the back of your mind, think about, so private markets are really good at producing private goods, like your laptops and your smartphone. Now that's going to be the next innovation. I'll have to take a smartphone. Not so good at producing public goods, right? The classic public good is national security, right? Should cybersecurity be considered just part of national security? And if so, shouldn't the government be doing more for that, right? And if so, who should be doing that? Should that be DHS, critical infrastructure? Should it be Cyber Command, right? If it's a foreign nation state going after a power grid, who should take point, right? Or should we just leave it up to companies the way we have been more or less since the 90s? That's kind of the interesting balancing act. That's like the multi-trillion-dollar question lurking behind the scenes here. Because got involved with Sony, didn't get as involved when JP Morgan was hit, right? Like a year or so later. And then this seems like a lifetime ago, right? But there was, believe it or not, a cybersecurity code of conduct there for a while around the theft of intellectual property. People disagree about how much of an impact that had, if any. It was certainly short-lived. I think we can all agree on that. I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, guys. Geopolitically, obviously, this has been very dicey times. In Ukraine, more broadly, we can talk more about that. Ukraine for a long time has been a hotbed of information warfare and cyber warfare. In the early days of the war, there was some talk about, well, why isn't cyber playing a bigger role here, right? Hey, aren't the Russians supposed to be really good at cyber attacks? Why aren't they just taking down the government, right, in that way? And just know that it's definitely not all quiet on the Eastern Front when it comes to digital attacks, right? There was a lot, and still is, a lot going on there, but it's not like cyber attacks are the equivalent of boots on the ground, right? So it really depends on what the goals are in a given invasion. But certainly this underscored that hybrid warfare, right? Cyber and kinetic means is certainly the way forward in these international armed conflicts. I mentioned the IoT, the fact that it is just exploding. Did do a book a few years ago as part of Oxford's What Everyone Needs to Know series on the Internet of Things. So again, that's just meant as a primer for a popular audience, so I'm happy to chat more about that stuff. This is an interesting example from that. Have you guys heard of Strava? So this was a Pentagon program, okay? So the Pentagon had this program to basically subsidize the cost of Fitbits and smartwatches so that soldiers stationed overseas could stay fit. This is good. We like a fit fighting force, right? This makes perfect sense. What do you think they forgot about?
Tracks other things?
Whoops, tracks it and uploads it to, in this case, a public cloud account that a savvy teenager in Australia was able to access and raise some questions about why are all these people running in rectangles in the northern Sahara? What they basically found was a CIA black site, right? So not ideal. The Navy had a similar program there for a while, also not ideal. So you got to think again about those unintended consequences. That attack surface, right? Not just moving toward the technological solution and not forgetting about these unintended consequences. A few just quick highlights of how some of these trends are playing out here in Indiana. We were asked by the governor's office to do, it's called the State of Hoosier Cybersecurity Report. So we did one in 2020. We're just finishing up the 2024 version to see how attitudes and practices changed during the pandemic. But just really in brief, guys, this went out to thousands of organizations around the state. It's classic good news, bad news. If you can call it good news, everybody's freaked out by the problem, right? So 95% of organizations were either somewhat or very concerned about cyber risk. This isn't causation at most, it's a correlation, but check it out, right? You were less likely to have been breached if you were a member of a critical infrastructure sector, right? That could be because of more onerous sector-specific requirements. It could be because of better information sharing through ISACs. Have you heard of ISACs? So many acronyms. Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, right? So each of these 16 critical infrastructure sectors has an ISAC attached to it, right? So this is to share information about cyber threats and best practices. And this is also part of the playbook for the private sector responding to data breaches. So after the Jeep Cherokee hack and others, we have the automobile ISAC, right? After big retail stores get hacked, we have the retail ISAC. We even have one for higher ed, right? That's actually in Bloomington, the REN ISAC. So hard to say. Those could be some of the forces playing out there. In terms of the types of attacks experienced here in Indiana, again, this was 2020. This is right before the pandemic when we were collecting these data, okay? So as a little bit of a teaser, ransomware has gone up, right, in the years since then. But back in 2020, ransomware, it was happening, not as much as it is today. Phishing, very common, right? Wire fraud, of course, also very common. These days, of course, it's not just phishing in terms of links, but it's, voice phishing or, phishing. So you get the call, it sure sounds like you're talking to so-and-so. If it's some poor grandparent, it sounds like their grandkids in spring break in Mexico, they gotta get bailed out of jail. Quickly, you gotta wire this. And unfortunately, that's happening tens of thousands of times, right? So the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is tracking about 30,000 of those incidents a year now, right? And this is one other really alarming, kind of more cutting edge one. Hong Kong, earlier this year, in February, there was a deep fake Zoom call. All right, so this woman, end of the day on a Friday, not like this, gets an invitation for a Zoom meeting, all right? Looks like it's coming from her boss. She clicks it, she gets on. It's her boss, it's the CFO of the company, right? And it's a variety of other people that she knows from the company. The connection's a little jinky, but she thinks, it's just Wi-Fi, right? She's talking to her boss in real time, okay? And then basically asks her to initiate this $25 million wire transfer. She does it. The whole thing was deep faked. Start to finish, all of it, right? So that's not like some, here's where we're headed. It happened in February. I mean, that's there, right? So I think, we're used to getting that cyber hygiene training around, don't click here or worry about the text or whatever, but that level of sophistication, I don't think a lot of us are really ready for as we look to next week being the start of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, right? So steps taken in response, just really briefly, guys, I'll just highlight, check out, there's a lot of stuff you would expect, but look at the third, column there, cyber risk insurance. Right? More than 60% of the organizations that responded to this had cyber risk insurance. All right, and again, these are a lot of local governments. These are a lot of little critical infrastructure providers, small water utilities, stuff like that, right? That was surprising. And what I would have expected, okay, was that, all right, the prices for insurance have gone up a lot the last 4 years, and the exclusions have also become problematic, right? Like one really quick one is an active war and hostile acts exclusion. All right, so if the US government attributes a cyber attack back to a foreign government, and you're the insurance company, and your client just was basically breached, right? You're gonna say, hostile act of war, I'm not gonna pay up, right? You're gonna rely on that, and a lot of companies have been trying to do that. It's been litigated all over the country now, right? So rising costs, a lot of exclusions, you would expect that bar to go down, it's gone up here in Indiana since 2020, right? In part because there's not a lot of other risk management tools, okay? And partly that's because, there's not a lot of other places to turn, which makes insurance, for what it's worth, a de facto cybersecurity regulator that is worth paying attention to, right? Because the types of controls they're requiring and the frameworks they're using in these audits are moving markets, right? They're really, really influential, even if you don't have a state that's as forward-leaning, right? Which we'll talk more about. And there was that active war exclusion. So a couple minutes on trend, then we'll talk about kind of maybe some good news before we turn to some more Q&A, okay? So really in brief, guys, think about like the OSI stack as kind of a metaphor here, but think about all these different layers as having vulnerabilities and needing tailored policies to address, right? Supply chain security, needless to say, has become a very hot topic, right? Even hotter than it was previously because of the events of the last few weeks. Hardware, for sure, security, supply chain security, also software, right? Again, sorry for all the acronyms. Have you heard of SBOM or CMMC? Look at all these nuggets, okay? Yeah, we got one at least, all right? So you've heard of CMMC?
SBOM.
SBOM, what's SBOM? What do we got?
Software bill of materials.
Yep, you got it, right? So software build, so picture like you're going shopping at the grocery store, you check out the back of the box, there's an ingredient list, right? It's the software equivalent, guys. Who coded this, where, when? Track back to see if you can figure out where that bug originated, right? It's a transparency tool. And it's increasingly being written into procurement contracts from the US government, and it's going international pretty quickly as well, okay? So it was a US Department of Commerce initiative originally a couple years ago, but it's gone pretty global, pretty mainstream, pretty quickly. CMMC is the Cyber Maturity Model certification. If you sell stuff to the Pentagon, as of later this year, you're gonna have to get CMMC certified. And if you sell toilet paper, it's tier 1. If you sell data centers, it's gonna be tier 3, right? But because so many companies sell stuff to the Pentagon, it's a pretty big deal to follow, hundreds of thousands of companies, right? So that tier 1 certification is also becoming a little bit of a cybersecurity floor, right? Like if nothing else, you gotta do that. So that's worth paying attention to as well. Protocols. One other quick hot topic, guys. Accountability for bugs, right? You've heard of move fast, break things, right? Patch Tuesday, put it out today, we'll patch it next month. That was Microsoft's approach, right, for a long time. They got better, now they're terrible again, right? I mean, full circle. So there's a very, very lively discussion going on about how to promote resilience in the software ecosystem. And one big tool that we have at our disposal to do that is to treat software companies, to treat tech companies the way we treat banks, right? So if you get a fraudulent charge on your credit card, you don't pay for it, but ultimately the bank does, right? So why should we allow tech companies, which back in the 90s, fair enough, these were small companies. Today, they're some of the biggest in the world, right? So why shouldn't we, basically promote accountability for the more sophisticated entities that are actually creating the code in the first place? The big news there is that the EU's already done it. They've extended something called the Products Liability Directive to software. So what does that mean? That means if you have a smart toaster that burns down your house because of a bug in the code, you can sue the software manufacturer that did it. Straight up. You don't have to prove negligence or anything, right? So there I was involved in a White House security summit back in March, and that was the topic that we discussed, is should the US follow suit with Europe? And even if we don't, is the fact that Europe going to be doing this now, how much is that going to influence US behavior, right? Because a lot of these same companies are selling to Europe, right? So that whole idea around accountability for software, very hot topic. We're doing an article right now called Moving Slow and Fixing Things to give you a flavor for kind of where I'm at with that stuff anyway. But bottom line guy here is just, be proactive, build in cybersecurity from the start, don't bolt it on after the fact. We've been throwing a lot of money at that problem, hoping some of it's well spent, right? That gets us thinking about this kind of market failure in cybersecurity. After all, I'm not sure, maybe you guys have looked at these and maybe not, but there was a big National Bureau of Economic Research study done on the impact of cyber attacks on stock prices. Do you think companies often take a bath after a big breach? Does their stock price go down a lot? Does the market punish them? Not really, right? Even Target's 1 quarter later was right back up, right? LinkedIn went up after its cyber attack. The average hit was about 1%, right? 1%. So we're not doing a very good job of internalizing the cost of cyber attacks, right? There's different ways we can do a better job there, but that's the context. One idea is to not just treat it as an exercise in cost-benefit analysis, but as a shared responsibility, right? So that gets us thinking about kind of what tools can we get from the CSR, ESG approach. There's this idea out there now called ESG plus T, with the T being technology. Eli Lilly is doing this now, so in some of their sustainability reports, they're talking not only about the environmental impact of their operations, but also the impact on digital ecosystems, right? So if you have an insulin pump that's internet connected, well, how are you helping to move that market to making sure it's as secure as possible? And you don't have to come in physically as the patient to get a firmware update, right? Something like that. And these are some of the other trends that I'm tracking, that we're all tracking right now. And if we had more time or during discussion, we can get more into some of these. Okay, so big things that are changing, right? One, especially since it's election season, we did have this pivot, guys, in how the US approaches cybersecurity in 2018, which was really a perceived failure to the 2016 cycle, right? And since 2018, the idea very much has been defend forward, or persistent engagement, go on the offense, right? Not just defense in depth, which is basically, layer as many security controls as possible, right? Build that moat. Now it's also, the idea of, we live in glass houses, but we're holding that rock and we're throwing them occasionally a lot more, right, than we used to. So that comes in different forms. One is setting these benchmarks for different critical infrastructure sectors. That's a big hot topic in cybersecurity and healthcare right now. Mentioned liability as well already. The Federal Trade Commission is doing more with this. This is kind of their top 10 wish list for cybersecurity. The big deal there is the Supreme Court just kind of clipped the wings of a lot of federal agencies. So now it's a lot easier to challenge when the FTC does this kind of thing than it used to be, right? So because of that, that puts the onus back on Congress and the states to regulate, okay? So some states, guys, are doing that more than others, needless to say. Ohio has an interesting law in the books. They basically have a safe harbor law, So they gave companies a menu of options to choose from. And if they follow one of those kind of list of industry best practices or this framework and they're still breached, they get to limit their liability. It's called an affirmative defense. So that's the carrot, all right? There was a discussion to do that here in Indiana. It was originally just going to be the NIST cybersecurity framework. That was the only option, but that got axed as just kind of being too narrow, and we haven't kind of brought it up again yet. But just note that the bottom line from this chart is it's not a red state, blue state thing. A lot of states are acting. 17 states now have these more comprehensive data privacy laws that are also on the books, including here in Indiana. Ours isn't enforced yet. It's not enforced until 2026, but believe it or not, we passed it as well. A lot of AI regulation as well is happening at the state level that we can talk more about. These are some of the different tools that can be used all the way down. When you run out of ideas, you can use the tax code, right? God help us. So I did a piece for the Wall Street Journal, like, I don't know, 3 months ago or something now, and we had an article that came out, and it was calling for, or at least exploring what a federal cybersecurity investment tax credit could look like. And I never said the acronym out loud until we were at a conference talking about it. It's the fuck it. So of course, we kept that acronym, and now you'll remember it too. The only state so far that has a cybersecurity investment tax credit is Maryland, right? They do have one, but that's it so far. There were a few different representatives in Congress who were interested, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm sorry, you have to bleep that one out. And then if we had more time, we could talk about all the different ways in which AI is being regulated, but I'll give you guys just a few snapshots, okay? So from the security side, needless to say, there's a lot happening. It's interesting to see the cross-pollination of efforts from the cybersecurity norms discussions we had to now AI, right? There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, including right now this week at the UN, talking about, well, what should the high-level framework be to build trust and safety in AI? And we're making some progress. This gives you a sense for what some of the big players are. We did a study, this was probably 2 years ago now, looking at all the national AI strategies published at the time. And there's a lot of convergence around a few ideas, like public benefit, like security. Pretty much all countries are worried about this. And of course, as you would guess, impact on workforce development as well. But a lot of private companies, as you see up there, Accenture, Google, IBM, you name it, they're all putting out their own ethical AI principles. What do they mean by AI, right? We're going to have a speaker in our CACR speaker series, the head of cybersecurity for McKinsey for North America, talking about how they're thinking about AI in February. If you're interested, we'll have the Microsoft folks coming out as well for that one. And it's an interesting exercise. So if you haven't looked at this before either, this would be fun to check out over the weekend. The MIT Moral Machine. So this is like the effort to kind of crowdsource ethics in autonomous vehicles, right? So it's like the trolley experiment for autonomous vehicles. And it just showed that all around the world, there's lots of different cultural expectations for how you would expect cars to operate when they're out of control. Do you protect pedestrians? Do you protect the occupants of the vehicle? How should that play out in regulations, versus the norms of these companies? Do we want to leave that up to Elon Musk to decide? Do you want to decide yourself when you're deciding what car to purchase? Do you want to toggle on, always protect pedestrians versus occupants? Like, how much power do we feel comfortable with, right? So there's a lot of ethical questions to kind of unpack there. And we did a study called, Shockingly Governing AI that did some of this as well that I can talk more about. The EU guys, there's this old refrain that, the US innovates, the EU regulates. This is an example of that in the AI context with their AI Act, right? So they have this classification system pretty well embedded. Certain AI activities are just banned now, right? Like you can't use AI for emotional recognition in public with security cameras, right? Can't do that at all anymore, okay? And some states are regulating that here, right? But in the EU, it's just banned. And you can see some examples kind of up and down the stack there. Here in the US, as you might know, it's an executive order, right? So we have the beginnings of a federal approach there, but because it's an executive order, there's no reason the next administration couldn't build on it or overturn it. So that's, benefits and drawbacks there. And we can talk more about that too, if anybody's curious about the current state of AI. I promised to leave you on a happier note though. So how about some good news before we, take your questions and see what direction you want to take the discussion. So I did this book on cyber peace with several colleagues, co-editors at Paris 8 and NYU. I was writing a book originally on cyber war when I was at Notre Dame, and it was just kind of depressing because we're just in cyber war all the time, right? So they're really known for their work on peace at Notre Dame. So I started to look into that. Well, what does positive peace mean for cybersecurity? What could that look like? Right? How do you lay a foundation that doesn't just help us put out the next fire, but actually build a more sustainable foundation, right, for the 21st century? So that's what this book tries to get at. We had folks all around the world contributing to it. It builds off of some early work from the World Federation of Scientists, and the Vatican, believe it or not, even did some early stuff on this. And it's borne some fruit. So this was the first ever, guys, multi-stakeholder effort. So what do we mean by multi-stakeholder? This means countries and companies coming together on one list of basically rules of the road, okay? This one's really wide-ranging. It's called the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. 6 years ago this came out. Every year it gets more adherence. And if you look down this list, it's kind of a grab bag, right? I mean, there's intellectual property up there. There's electoral integrity, keeping in mind this was a few years after 2016. There's even private sector hackback, right? Which has also become a pretty hot topic that we can talk about. Remember Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, right? You're not supposed to hack into another organization without permission, right? How many prosecutions do you think there have been by the US Department of Justice against companies that have hacked? Back. 0, right? So again, it's law in action, and in the books, right, it's a classic enforcement issue. The good news here, guys, is that we now have these 11 cyber norms that were originally a G20 initiative, and now they've been sanctioned by the UN. They're basically the 11 rules for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. The issue is they're norms, right? What happens when norms are violated? Kind of depends. Kind of depends, right? Depends if there's states that want to step up and enforce those norms, right? So opening days of the war in Ukraine, Viasat's hacked, right, by Russia, right? This was the first time that the EU ever attributed a cyber attack back to a foreign government. The EU, the US, and the UK in this case did, and levied sanctions in response because attack on civilian critical infrastructure, right? But again, it's up to nations to enforce these. There's no multilateral treaty on this stuff yet. There is one on cybercrime. And there was basically a new addendum to that was just negotiated a couple weeks ago that we can talk about. It's been very controversial. In the book, we looked at, well, what are some different ways to think about the end state here? We did some stuff around FDR's 4 freedoms. We looked at these 4 pillars, so kind of respecting human rights, spreading internet access, this multi-stakeholder idea. How do you build from some of the work around sustainable development? Big community that's active in this, which is exciting. And we did a virtual Davos event, and for this one we looked at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we thought about the privacy and the security features that are required to meet all of those really laudable but hard to achieve initiatives, right? Like safe drinking water, everybody deserves access to that, I think that's fair to say, but if you don't think about the security as was brought up of that, you're not going to get all the way there, right? So that gives you guys a flavor. There's hope, there's some progress, right? But there's certainly a long way to go. So I wish we had more time. We think we still have 5 or 7 minutes or so for some discussion. So would love that. We have a lot of different directions we can take it. But first, just thanks again for the opportunity. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
We do have quite a bit of time for questions. If anybody's got questions, raise your hand.
I tried to leave some time. Yes, please.
I have a question regarding some of the tools that are being used for protection, but also the tools themselves getting attacked. The software that Plantier creates is very useful for combating scams and stuff like that. But then there are questions of them moving out of the government sector and providing that to private companies, and the system itself is getting hacked somehow, and they're being used to conduct more scams. Do you believe in giving more people access to the tools is more helpful for security, or would you believe something that's a strictly enforced DoD government kind of situation that's more helpful?
What a classic debate, right? I love it, right? It almost gets into the classic, open source debate. Is it better just to have lots and lots of eyeballs looking at these issues, right? And we're all going to be better off as kind of like a wisdom of the crowds, or like a common scenario, right? Versus, do we want to keep it proprietary? The Apple model, right? Really closed down. We want to have vertical integration control over the whole stack, right? I think there's benefits to both. One issue in the software liability context is what do you do about open source, right? What do you do about Linux, right? Remember that researcher, what was it, 6-9 months ago now, he's flying back from Germany and uncovers what could have been one of the most damaging cyber espionage campaigns in history because it looked like certain systems were running slower than they should have been. And he was a volunteer, right? So open source. So, maybe you would have had that same thing, that same discovery if it would have been a closed, ecosystem potentially, but maybe not, right? So, I don't think it's possible to really unwind a lot of the way in which the internet actually functions today from that really grassroots civil society model. I mean, it's amazing still how much of what we rely on every day is ran by volunteers all around the world, for sure. And there's a lot of benefits to it. It can be manipulated. There's problems with it for sure, but there's also a lot of benefits. So I'm more of a believer in that, especially after working with Scott Bradner on that book that I mentioned than I used to be. But I mean, for certain things, the proprietary model, I mean, there's just no way around it. And if you're the DoD, I mean, here's one example. So we do a lot of supply chain work with the Crane Naval Surface Warfare Division, which is half an hour or so south of Bloomington. They do, among other things, the supply chain for the Trident missile systems, so nuclear triad stuff. So they're testing each individual transistor, right? I mean, you can't do that if you're Amazon or Huawei, right? Even if you wanted to. But for certain aspects of whatever your crown jewels are, I mean, there's no choice, right? You have to do that. And even if you're a company, I mean, 80+% of your value is tied up these days, oftentimes in trade secrets and know-how, right? So figuring out what those crown jewels are, building in that proprietary moat, that's pretty much the whole ballgame. So it has to be a bit of both, I think, in other words. So great question. Other questions that might come to mind? Yeah, please. Yeah.
So let's say you're a relatively small business in one of those non-critical infrastructure sectors. So a sector without such or detailed regulation on how to prevent or protect against cyber attacks.
Sure.
What would you recommend? How do you recommend you starting on trying to protect yourself from becoming a victim of cyber attacks?
Yeah. What are the basics, right? I'm asking for a friend or whatever. Yeah. Well, happy to talk about it. I know we can all give you resources as well, right? I mean, there are some startups that are just easy. There is, for example, in this cybersecurity framework guide for small business that takes it in more nuanced, easy to understand language you through some of these same steps, right? Looking through some of those just baseline controls, like I mentioned at tier 1 of the cyber maturity model certification. I mean, it's stuff like multi-factor authentication. It's some of the basics, right? That can be useful. And then, there's that, I've mentioned just briefly, that Federal Trade Commission slide up there. That was basically security for business. That's the kind of stuff they're looking for. If you're a really small business, you're not going to need to do some of the stuff like segmenting your networks necessarily, but, you might. It just kind of depends on what line of business you're in, right? So the short answer is we're all three of us are happy to help you with with that. There are some resources out there. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. The bigger issue is we don't have one definition for what reasonable cybersecurity is, right? You can either answer that through a standard or a rule, right? A rule would be like the EU. They have the General Data Protection Regulation. Here's 88 pages of regulations, and then they supplement it with the Network Information Security Directive, and now the AI Act and all this stuff, right? There's a set of rules. Or Australia, they have the Essential 8. Here's 8 security controls we pretty much require across the board. The US doesn't have that, right? We do some sectors, some states, it kind of depends, so that makes it tough for business, right? So the number one reason when we asked in that survey, why don't you invest more in cybersecurity, is that they didn't know where to put that next dollar of investment, right? Should you put it in insurance? Should you put it in cyber hygiene training for your employees? Should you put it in end-to-end encryption? They just weren't sure. So I think we need to do a better job, as a state, as the academy, of kind of communicating what the baseline, the basic stuff is, at least. So it's understandable that you'd be a little bit confused, in other words. Other questions? Yeah, no, please.
So emerging technologies,
Yeah.
quantum and neuromorphic, where do you fall
Look at
on
that.
the scale of it's never going to happen versus we need to panic right now? And
Exactly, right,
and
yeah.
are those career paths worth kind of jumping up and down? And why?
Oh, great question, right? Because there's a lot of flashes in the pan, right? I mean, if we would have been having this discussion 2 or 3 years ago, it'd be all metaverse and blockchain. Blockchain's the answer, regardless of the question. It's going to be amazing. So yeah, it's a great. We are doing a speaking of flash in the pan, but there's going to be a kind of a quantum computing conference at IU in the spring. It's going to be at the Memorial Union, and there's a lot of folks from the federal agencies, a lot of industry folks who are going to be there. So whoever is interested, I'm happy to send out. It'll be an interesting gathering. There'll be folks from Purdue, folks from Notre Dame. Hopefully we can get some folks from Rose, there as well, including you guys who are interested. So that'll be a fun discussion. That's the first that I'm aware of kind of quantum computing security conference that we're having, at least with IU involved. So I think, there's some folks who think that there's a good chance we just might not get there with quantum computing, right? Like, it's going to be interesting. It's not going to be like the game changer, right? But it could be such a game changer that it's one of those things that you have to pay attention to it, and it's hard to take out that crystal ball, which for me at least, again, being a non-computer scientist, is still pretty opaque. But I think it's from a policy perspective, thinking of careers, the more that you can get on the bandwagon for all of those different emerging technologies and at least be conversant in them is going to be great, right? Then you can strike when the iron's hot with whatever the flavor of the moment might be, like when you're on the market, right? So quantum neuromorphic computing, we have a couple of experts at IU on that. I'm sure you guys probably do here as well. It's brand new, right? It could be a real game changer for those who haven't followed it, especially the environmental impact of things like AI. These large language models take a boatload of resources, energy, a lot of emissions associated. So this is like just a sliver of that if we can get that right. But again, it's early days, but it could be a game changer, right? It could absolutely be a game changer. So, like, I'm teaching a class on the law and ethics of emerging technologies, and those are two of them that you just said. So we're paying attention to them. Do I think it's going to be like, the defining technology of the 21st century? It's really hard to say. I mean, if you'd have asked me that 2 years ago with AI and where we are today, I mean, wow, maybe. I think if I were sitting in your seat right now, though, yeah, I would really try to, follow as closely as possible. But, again, just spread, make sure you have your bases covered. It's not like cybersecurity is going away, AI, it might not get end all be all, but it's not going away either. So, yeah, I think I quickly flashed that Super 7 slide, and I think at least knowing the nuances of the debates around each of those 7 will get you most of the way there.
I heard the bell ring.
Oh, did you? Well done. Okay.
We should thank you one more time. Let's thank the speaker. If you want to ask him more questions, we can stick around for a little while and have kind of an informal discussion.
I will hang out.
But thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Of course.
Yeah.